Okay, so recording here, and we're going to kick off. We're going to kind of treat this like a funnel. Like we'll go big picture, we'll look at some course resources, then we'll dig in and spend a majority of our time looking at some unit level resources, and then we'll kind of hone down and we'll recap some of those lesson level resources that Pam was able to dabble and Angela helped show a little bit. And then, like Stephanie said, we'll make sure you're all set up and your classes are good to go for the first day as well. That's, most important step. So there's a couple of different ways. Okay, am I still screen sharing? Zoom took away the little green outline and now I'm second guessing myself every time I share. So, okay. So you always have this little table of contents that's over on the left side, and you'll have buttons to navigate in the main area too. So if I go to Math 7 to Grade 7 here, I have that table of contents and it's the same as what's in here together. Looking at the full course overview here, the Math 7 overview, there's some high-level resources that might be helpful as you guys dig in. These might be things where you're like, not yet. We're just tackling a unit, Katie. We don't need the full shebang here. Totally okay, but we've got a full year glossary. I love the visuals that are on that. You have the year at a glance, which is, an outline of the different units and approximate lengths and time that it takes. And then there's some family resources here too. If you're wanting to dig in to specific standards, this is a robust document that goes through all the standards and all of the lessons, and it has it organized in a couple of different ways here. So if I zone in on a unit then, and we're kind of funneling down here, I'm going to go into unit 4 because, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the one you guys are going to be digging into here in a little bit? Okay, so if I dig into unit 4 and I just use that table of contents, there's always these drop downs that can help you navigate to different grade levels and different units. And if you're like me, you can always go home too. That was an accident, but home is always that safety. If you get lost in the click trail, you can always get home safely. So a couple of important things about units is, just like Angela was showing us that the lessons kind of have their prescribed routine that it follows every time, units are pretty much the same way. So in every unit you have a readiness check. It is more of a prerequisite check, so it's not as much of like the pre-test, post-test that you might have seen with some other resources. So it digs into some below grade level content that's relevant for the unit. I love the readiness checks. I think they're kind of one of the most underrated resources, personally. You have different sections of lessons. So you'll see the units are kind of broken into big ideas, big topics, and you can kind of see the lessons that are laid out in each section. You have at least one practice day and quiz in each unit as well. Oftentimes there's more than one, depending on, the unit and the length. But you'll have a practice day that's always paper-based. Always really flexible, like scavenger hunts, card sorts, different kind of interactive paper pieces. Quizzes are real short, little five question formatives to help along the way. You've got another section here. We've got another practice day. And then you always have an end of unit assessment, and you have some reflection and synthesis, which is just some generalized unit reflection tools, not specific to content, but like, how did it go? What do you want to change for next unit? And those are really fun to go through with kids. Also, our end of unit assessments all have 2 versions. So there's some flexibility there. If you do revisions or retakes, we have some schools that use them as Form B as a study guide for Form A. So there's lots of different flexible uses. Some like giving different kids in the room different forms because they want to mix it up. So I love the flexibility, but it's really to use however you want to use it in your classroom and how it's best for your students. So I'm going to navigate just back to this main unit 4 where we could kind of see how everything's outlining. And really for planning purposes and digging in to know what the heck is going on in this unit, the unit overview is kind of your one-stop shop for a lot of that stuff. So in your unit overview, and I'll give you some time to explore on your own and click in and read a little bit. In the unit overview, you have some big picture information with vocab, with those kind of big ideas and the goals. And as you scroll down here, you have some of the big planning and resource tools down here. This unit facilitation guide, that's like the golden ticket in my book. That really lays out a lot of stuff. I always print this and have it on hand because it gives me the prior learning that they're bringing in, or, you know, we hope they're bringing in. It gives where we're going, and that helps me not overteach, but also make sure they have that foundation set for later grades, later units. Again, some more big picture idea. We have some standard breakdown. And then as we scroll, we get info, just like a snapshot of every lesson and any different notes or considerations that go with that vocab that's present. So I love this document. I hope I'm not making us seasick here. Even at the bottom, if you get to a point where you're like, oh my God, I'm like 10 days behind, what's happening? I need to make up time. There's even some consideration for how you might do some creative combining, or things that might be okay to omit that aren't going to impact the big picture of grade 7 or of this unit. So I love that. We got some more connections to prior stuff. Yeah.
May I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Scrolling back to page 5,
Mm-hmm.
the considerations for omission. Is it true that, and maybe I heard this with IM, it would be preferred to skip an entire lesson as opposed to parts of a lesson? Is that the thinking?
It depends. So our curriculum writers went through lesson by lesson to craft these recommendations. So sometimes it is a full lesson. So sometimes it's like, hey, lesson 1, we're just really drawing up background knowledge. New content is really being introduced. So really, you know, pending on if they're ready, that could be skipped. I'll just be transparent with you guys in here. My biggest mistake my first time through this was, if it said optional, I cut it. I was like, I got to make up the time. I got to do it. I had big regrets because it's almost like, if your students have that understanding, feel free to skip it. And I kind of did it blindly. So definitely worth still looking through and digging into. But Mitchell, to kind of dig in here, like this is a little bit more like these 2 lessons, you could take bits and pieces from each. So it might not be cutting the whole lesson at a time, but you're kind of like taking important parts of similar lessons. Like half answers your question a little bit. So love the unit facilitation guide. I'm going to kind of hop back to that unit overview page that had all of those resources. There is a unit overview video. I love those because I'm a multitasker. I want it on while I'm jotting down notes, while I'm, snacking. And the video is pretty much all of that info that I showed you in the unit facilitation guide, but with a curriculum writer and a coach walking you through it. And it shows some fun visuals. It's not going to get quite as in-depth because they're really 10 to 20 minutes. They're really meant to be kind of like an overview snapshot. But I love those videos if you kind of latch on to that type of presentation of materials. I love the family resource. I'm going to call that out because while it's named for families, I think this is another one that has lots of flexible uses because it goes through different concepts in real chewable language. It has representations, it has visuals, and if I go down, it has more problems that you could pull, like families could work on them. You could probably pull these for some extra practice, and even if you send them home, the kids, I don't know, they probably wouldn't notice. It does have an answer key for if you have those eager families saying, we want to practice at home, we want to do something at home, like, hey, here's your fun thing, you can work through this as we go. So I love to call that out as well. So that's kind of some big unit planning resources here. Obviously, just like good planning in general, you have access to the end of unit assessment. I always work on that before I start a unit just to see what expectation level is. I always like to look at the cool downs for each lesson. And if you don't want to click through each lesson to look at that cool down, they are in a collection here at the bottom of this little table of contents. So I always love working through it as a kiddo, seeing, where I think they might snag, what's going to be, what I anticipate will be well received. Lots of resources within a unit, an overwhelming amount, as it turns out. So I am going to stop talking a little bit and give us some time to just dig in and work through some planning together. With that, I'm going to I'm going to share this with you. This is just a little unit planning deep dive. So I'll put it in the chat. And if you want to make a copy of it, feel free to. If it's not your jam, ignore it. That's totally okay. Or if you want to bookmark it for later, because you're like, now's not the time, Katie, I'm too overwhelmed. Totally okay. If you are sometimes a little scatterbrained like me, I like getting it all down and having it in one place to refer back to. So I dropped that in the chat, and it should ask you to make a copy if, as you go through on your own here, you want to jot some notes down. So I'm actually going to, let me check my time really quick here. So I'm going to give us probably maybe 10-ish minutes to just really dig in and look at Unit 4 together. If there's things that catch your eye that you're like, oh, this is interesting and new, or like, this is scary and new, I invite you to share that out loud with your colleagues. You're going to be going through this together in a little bit. If you just want to take some personal notes, take some personal notes. And you are welcome to dig in and look at some lessons, but we will kind of funnel down and look at some of those lesson level resources together as well in a little bit. So don't feel pressure to do that. So I'll be here if you have questions.
Katie, before we break into this,
Yes.
Catherine had a question around the suggested time length for each lesson. Is it a day, multiple days? Is it kind of vary?
Yes, that's a great question. Most of the lessons are designed for 45 minutes. That being said, show yourself grace because it won't take 45 minutes at first. At least for me, it won't. Sometimes I get, like Angela said, I get excited with the warm up and I'll spend 15 minutes on a 5-minute warm up because I'm really excited about it. That's normal. So don't beat yourself up if you're not making it through a whole lesson at first. There's a couple that I'm even wondering if there's one in this unit. So I'm going to click into that unit facilitation guide that I had open. And here's right here. So we have like one call out that this lesson was actually designed for 2 class periods. So if it doesn't have that note, you can assume it's kind of built for one. Sometimes they have a little note of like, hey, this might take longer. So, plan accordingly. Great questions. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute just so we can see faces. And if you have any questions that pop up, do so. And I will work on getting some of those people some access, Catherine, that you shared. How were we on a scale of this is cool versus, oh my God, I'm over capacity right now?
Is there typically only one quiz and one end of unit assessment each?
I would say that kind of depends on unit length. I would say typically one or two. So if you have a somewhat, a little bit of a chunkier unit, you might see two quizzes in there and then your end of unit assessment. But I think you're right in calling out, for the most part, it'll have kind of a quiz after that first big idea, and then the end of unit assessment, which is still cumulative over everything. Great question.
I have one student in particular who has written into their IEP that they should not have access to technology because it's like a impulse control issue. What are your suggestions for supporting that student to truly engage in the learning while also um, being mindful of their needs? Because I think that it's not many kids, but there are some kids who just have that as an ongoing issue.
It's a real life, and management is a whole different beast with tech in the picture in general. So I think that's a great question, and I don't think there's a magic bullet for that, but I will say in my classroom, my students really benefited when they were on 2-to-1 devices. So even if every kiddo had a device, I would say a majority of the time I kept them 2-to-1, because not only did it help with collaboration and talking and sharing, but it kind of was that built-in support for the accountability piece for students who have the wandering eyes, but also the students who might have those limitations, for whatever reason, if it's IEP, if it's behavior, whatever it might be. So that might be something worth trying with those students, kind of some strategic partners with that. I've been in some classrooms where they'll print out the note sheet and the student will just kind of like follow along, and they'll jot some stuff down. They might not be getting quite as much out of that experience because they're not exploring and playing around on their own end, but if it's a band-aid that needs to happen, it's a band-aid that needs to happen. So those are a couple of things to try, but it kind of depends kiddo by kiddo on what's going to work for them. So again, another like half answer for you. I'm full of great half answers for you guys.
No, I really appreciate that feedback, and I really actually like the idea of the 2-to-1 as a tool for increasing the conversation and accountability. Just for those of us, I was also just thinking about like using the tablet mode. It would be a really good tool for our students so that there's not that barrier to conversation.
I love
Yeah.
that. And we've even seen 2-to-1 really creatively. So like one partner's in charge of the screen, but they're not allowed to type, or they're not allowed to play, or it's just like a more of a partnership. Now it does come, just to be totally honest, with like when they're collaborating, if me and you, Catherine, were partners and we were working on your device, I don't have that record on my end now of that lesson. So that's something to consider. But in my observations, not many kids are going to go back to it anyway. And if they're the kind that go back, those are the kiddos that might want to use their device in the partnerships, if that makes sense. So there's some give and take with each of them, but that's definitely something that kind of was a game changer for me.
Yeah, I guess I'm just gonna share the same fear. It's like you're asking me to compete with the internet, and uh that's like not possible. You know what I mean? So um yeah, that's just like my biggest fear when if when we switch over to this kind of stuff. And I was kind of just wondering if you saw anything like that that you had to deal with in your classes. And it's the 2-to-1 thing might work and stuff like that, but it's just like yeah, anything else like that you saw, or you can kind of share some info.
Yeah, no, it's very real.
Because
I mean, y'all are right to call that out. That is, I even have the attention span of a fly sometimes, and I'm like a grown adult human. So like sometimes with, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, what are we expecting from them? So I'd say a lot went into norm and expectation building, which I think you'll hear till you're blue in the face just about like classrooms altogether. And that's just something that we know as educators. So that was a huge piece, just really being firm with expectations and norms about doing lessons on tech and having that access open all the time. I definitely was pretty strategic with when we were pausing and discussing, your devices were closed. They were down. You could open it back up and get to it, but an easy way to scan the room and say, hey, okay, you worked on this. You played with your floats and anchors, but while we're talking and we're looking at work together, your device is face down or you're closed because I want eyes on me or other humans in the room to actually have a conversation together with that. So kind of that pause tool that you experienced, don't be afraid to like take that a step further and say, okay, like hands off, sit on your hands, do whatever you need to with squirrely 7th graders to do that. And I will also share, just to be totally honest with you. So I'm thinking back to that floats and anchors lesson that we just did. There's some cool visualizations that you wouldn't have gotten without the tech, right? Like cool playing around with those, but like a card sort, like, yes, there's the auto check, but maybe that's an opportunity to not be on devices. Maybe there's opportunities for discussion and exploration that doesn't have to be on a computer. And those are times where I can use my professional judgment as a teacher to say, is the tech supporting this? If so, yes, it's worth it to invest in that. But maybe an activity too, maybe if we're comparing 2 different students' work, maybe we just close our computers for that. So I definitely just want to empower you too to, in planning and in lesson planning, look at it and say, are we benefiting from the tech here? And a lot of times the answer is yes. So it's not always an easy question to ask, but are there opportunities to take where we don't get that tech fatigue and the wandering eyes? Because you're right, Shane, that's real. And it's hard to compete with the internet and the tabs and the games and the everything that's going on at once. Have you guys been, just totally curious, what's students' experience with like devices in your district, like leading up to this?
All our students have Chromebooks, and I can say from like my personal experience in my class that anytime we use them, it is a battle to even get them on the right tab. I had a kid straight up watching Netflix in my class yesterday, and I couldn't get him on what we were supposed to be doing.
So they've had the access, but maybe it's been not necessarily been something that's held the resources as much as it might now. Is that kind of like a fair summary? Like they've had it, they're used, but maybe not to this extent in a classroom up to this point.
I don't know about for math, maybe for another subject, but for sure for not math.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know our students, like many of our classes, use them daily in science because that's where a large portion of the curriculum lives. I personally have used a lot of the Desmos tools, even because we have had CPM, there's some embedded stuff there, including the floats and anchors lesson. And I have seen it be really successful, but there's always, a few kids who you need to be strategic about and how to support them. I was just thinking too a little bit around like my own room setup and how I might adjust that for instruction where I can have a better sense of what all students are working on or what's on their screens. Like I was thinking like a horseshoe shape versus the groups I have now might be a way for me to support their engagement and learning.
No, I was just thinking about adjusting to like just partners that are all facing the Promethean board, just because that way I can stand at the back and see everyone's screens.
And I definitely too, just to kind of build on that, I encourage you guys too that while teachers have that cool dashboard view, you know, they have the cool way to look, like, don't let that stop you from circulating and actually touching base with students in groups and partners. Like, if that's part of your what you do now, where you are circulating and you are asking questions to groups and you're meeting with individuals, that can still be part of this. You know, that cool dashboard and that feedback, that's an option, and those are tools for your tool belt, but don't feel like that's the only way that this is going to work. Because if you want to keep that connection and kind of that proximity accountability of, if I'm coming around, I'm going to see what you're doing, lean into that as well too. So I think, no, these are great call outs, you guys, and it's hard. John, I was in the same boat. I was hardcore paper pencil workbook, and unless I found something that I was like, this is cool, we'll do this. It was more of a one-off. Just in my experience, and I'm not even saying it because I work here, I promise, Scouts of Honor, Desmond's kind of changed the game for me in that, because it was more often I was finding the cool activities that I wanted to use. So then that kind of, it reshaped what my classroom looked like, because I was like, wait, this is now like becoming the norm for me. And then it changed the expectations, and it might be, you guys might collaborate with your teams and with each other that are kind of implementing this unit together to say, hey, we're in a little bit of an uphill battle because it's January, it's February, and we're kind of switching norms on them now. You know, we're switching up the way this is gonna look in our classroom. What considerations and do we need to make, and what grace do we need to show ourselves and our students? Because that's a big change up for you guys. That's a big change up for kiddos. And I could definitely see it unraveling different than if it was like at the beginning of the school year where you got them fresh, if that kind of makes any sense. I think there's some unique challenges that it poses. Oh, I love the idea of maybe a rubric for that kind of thing. That doesn't exist on our end, Catherine, but that's something I'm going to jot down and make a note of to kind of take back to our team to chat about, because I think that's like tech management is a huge component of using this resource, and I think that's super interesting. I'm also curious to see too, because a lot of times some of these lessons are a little more sometimes more dynamic than some of the tech they've used in the past in math, or, you know, in ELA or whatever. I'm curious if the lesson design and the engagement is going to impact their on task, or like the what we're afraid of them being off task. Maybe not. So I'm curious to maybe like check in with you guys down the road to say, hey, what's it look like now that we're, you know, it's in the hands of kiddos and we're implementing. Yeah, I have talked through this whole time I was going to give you to to explore. So I apologize, but I want to be able to show you kind of some lesson specific stuff, and I want us to know how to get a class set up and get assigned. So I apologize that I like talked through our whole planning, you know, our whole free time part, but you know where to find the stuff and kind of have some of the tools now for that. So I'm confident in you in that. So I'm
I would just like to affirm, Katie, that you're taking use of a teachable moment, and we're all circulating around a very important topic.
Mhm.
So I, for one, don't feel like that was a lost bit of time. So
For sure. And I wish I had a magic bullet answer for you guys. You know, I wish there was a nice bow to wrap that up and tie it on, but that's just nothing in our classrooms is that way. And I'm curious too, the ways of taking the challenges of some classroom management and on-task behavior that we do see even with paper pencil, and how does that change with tech, and why does it change with tech, and is it that different, and is it, you know, I'm thinking out loud, so I'm wondering out loud.
yeah, I've been listening to, you know, what my peers have been saying, and I don't have a pithy, you know, like you said, a silver bullet. For me, the any special sauce would just be about that relationship. And I've been in plenty of classrooms where students doing X, whether it's tech or whatever, and if the teacher's not aware of it, addressing it, the kid's likely going to do what they're going to do until they get sort of a called out for it. So for me, it was always trying to build a strong culture, and that we have loose and tight agreements, and that there are natural and artificial consequences that go with various things, myself included. And I think kids are different now than in some ways than when I was younger. But I think you just have to build in, like, give them all the reasons to engage, and some built-in reasons for, like, okay, well, if you don't, then here's some natural consequences. So it's not an easy thing.
No, it's not, and it's a
Yeah.
big, thank you for sharing that, Mitchell.
Yeah.
It's not a big shift, and Shane, like, it's a big shift for us too. It's a big shift for educators a lot of times. And writing down, you commented on writing things down. I want to revisit that once I get into a lesson, because I think that's a really good point. And I want to call out some things that I've seen. So I'm going to share my screen again here. And I'm in that lesson 4 still. So I'm going to look in, you can see here on the little table of contents in the unit, you can see the lessons, you can see where the practice and the quizzes fall. That little paper icon, that indicates whether if it's a paper lesson. So if you look here, this is going to be not reliant on screens at all. And it's a resource where they are working, and there's sometimes projection sheets that you could pull up on your computer or on your document camera or whatnot, but those are kind of sprinkled in here. As we can see, it's not quite half, but there's a considerable amount. I forgot to mention too, all of the assessments you can do digitally or paper. So your readiness check, your quizzes, your end of unit, all flexible with the exact same questions. You could have students do them digitally or have them work on paper, or give them the option. So forgot to mention that before, so I wanted to call that out. So I'm going to go into a lesson here. I'm just going to go into lesson 1 of this. You can see here, I've assigned it to some of my kiddos, some of my model classrooms that I have taught with before. But overview, I want to show some resources here. So we've got, again, like with the unit, our big picture information, learning goals. The learning goals are huge for me because I overteach like crazy. I get ahead of the goal. I get excited. I want to be helpful. I get ahead of it. Learning goals are great. Instructional routines are kind of called out specifically in here, or options for that. Here you can see with the little screens, you can click through and you can work them like a student. It's not going to save your work, but if you just want to play around and see the engagement, you can do that. And you'll notice here at the bottom, there's tabs of those different teacher moves. So things that Pam was using, like pacing recommendations, different questions to ask, maybe facilitation tools, that lives in here. It's by no means a script, but it's definitely a great starting place for looking for ways to engage with your students on this. There's just that sample responses, and as you click through here, I'm going to find one that shows here we have an example of some student supports. So that'll encompass some different scaffolds for students with disabilities, for any EL students you might have in your classroom. Some of them are kind of vague and big picture, but some of them are really, really concrete. And I always like to check those, and really any students benefit from those, not necessarily in those populations. So if you're like me though, I can't manage the tabs and the dashboard and knowing what's going on. I am not that well equipped with tech multitasking. So I want to print it, and I want to write on it, and I want to scribble on it. So I'm going to come back. This is that main lesson 1 page. And up here next to the title, you'll see the teacher guide. I wish this was like big and 20-point font and highlighted here. So as you go in, it's all of that general information, some preparation checklists, some time, recommended timing. But then as you go down, it's all of those different suggestions and recommendations that go with each of the screens. Again, you don't have to consider this a script. You guys are professionals. You've been doing this. So, but it's a great starting point to say, hey, what are my look fors and what are some questions I could ask? And where should I stop and where should I just let them keep going? So that's a great thing. This is printable. I always have to print it and, highlight and add notes because that's how I plan. I'm a paper planner. So I wanted to call out the teacher guide. Angela kind of showed you that with each lesson there's notes and you have that editing flexibility. You can pull it up in Spanish. So we have a lot of accounts, kind of back to Shane, what you were bringing up about some benefit of writing some stuff down. I don't think that's I think that's a fair judgment. I've seen some success in students kind of following along, even if these notes aren't exactly matches to the activity, they'll jot down synthesizing along the way. They'll write down vocabulary. They'll write down some steps that they learned. I have also seen teachers, which I thought was really creative, take just a blank computer paper and they'll have students fold it into rectangles. And that's kind of like during the warm-up, you use a rectangle to jot stuff down. And then on the next screen, you'll use the next little rectangle to jot stuff down. Again, not a perfect fit because it's not going to have the problem on it for them, but it's a great place to get thinking down on paper and to do any synthesizing and kind of that direct piece you might want to afterwards with the class. So there's some creative ways I've definitely seen to get thoughts and synthesis on paper without feeling like they have to work everything out on paper, if that makes sense. But great questions that you've brought up. I'm talking a mile a minute. Any big lesson level questions before we look at quickly like how to make a class and assign some things? Okay, so you can always go up to your name up here and you could go into your classes. That's always going to live here. If you were back on just the home page, I'm going to navigate to the home page. You can always find classes in that big kind of table of contents over here too. Remind me real quick if you guys are you a Google Classroom or do you live separate from that?
Google.
We use Google Classroom.
Okay, awesome. Even easier because when you go and you add a new class, there is this button just to import your Google Classroom in. If you have co-teachers in Google Classroom, it's going to add them automatically. So it's going to essentially roster your students for you. And you can kind of see here, I have added a Google Classroom class here. That has all of one student in it, but that's kind of what it looks like. You can click to see your list of students in here. You can sync. So if you have a student that joins next week, all of a sudden, you can just sync it and it'll update with Google Classroom in live time. And then assigning is just as easy. So I'm going to just navigate to a random lesson here. So I'm going to go into Unit 4. And if I go into a lesson to assign, here on that big planning page, I can just click here and I can assign it to my classes. And if I have 5 classes in the day, I can just checkbox it and it's going to assign it to each class.
So I have a real quick question. I was just looking at adding a new class and our stuff is set up through our Outlook email addresses, not our Gmails. And so it says that we have to have it set up through our Gmails to directly import from a.
Hey, super interesting. I might get with Ivan on that. I'll mention that to him and see. I will just preview here too. If you guys don't end up navigating through Google Classroom, adding a new class is also just as simply as, let's see, what's the date today? January 28th. I can add that class, and then students can join just the way that you guys joined the activity today, but they only have to join it once and they get all the activities from the year. So they don't have to join every single activity. So without Google Classroom, one more step for students to join on that very first day, but not a whole lot of extra beyond that. But thank you for checking into that, because that's a great call out, Maddie. So yeah, then looking in, if I go back, so that lesson is assigned to all of my classes here, and to see kind of that teacher view that Pam was showing as we were interacting, you click into the dashboard for that lesson, and that's where all of that student work is going to populate, and where you'll see all of the answers your students produce, and you're able to capture that thinking and provide feedback. So, oh, great, creative, adding Gmail as the co-teacher, very creative. Okay, wow, mile a minute. Do we feel mostly equipped to kick off? Like, I know how to create a class, I know how to assign it, and I know how to access that dashboard to see their work. Okay, thank you guys for being patient with me, and I appreciate the conversation that we had, kind of in the middle with some really important, relevant things to do that. So I'm going to actually ask us to leave the room and head back to the big breakout room, and we'll have some more time to maybe hear any questions that other groups might have, ask anything that you might want for the greater good of the group, and give some of your feedback to us as we